cops and other law enforcement people of Reddit, what were some cases you worked on that made you think, even if for a moment, that something supernatural/paranormal was going on? Part 2. My partner and I received a 911 call from an old woman having a dispute with someone. We get to the house, and she says she is alone. We say, "Who are you having a dispute with?" She says, "Oh, just this spirit in one of my rooms." Immediately me and partner look at each other and give the old "she's elderly, it's prob dementia" or something along those lines. As we're talking to her, she's explaining how sometimes a bad spirit comes around. She states that he's in the back room and, of course, the lights don't work. We try to tell her that spirits probably aren't in her house, and we have to get to another 911 call. She insists we check it out. So, we do. Now, the house, the way she was speaking about spirits, made me believe something was there. When we got to the room and she opened the door, seeing a ghost wouldn't have shocked me. She did say that it's usually in the corner up on the ceiling. Well, that corner was dark and had the freakiest shadow that legitimately was terrifying. My partner and I shined our flashlights on the whole room and thankfully, nothing was there. We told the lady, "Nope, you're good, nothing going on here." I said to her, "If you feel there's a spirit there, the NYPD cannot help you. Go to a local church religious institution of your choosing, and best of luck." We get out of there. Not Ellie, but am paramedic/fire. Late summer night, responding to a call in a rural area. My partner and I were driving down a winding 2-lane highway in the middle of nowhere. No light of any kind other than the headlights and moon. We're coming up on a sharp right turn when I see a man traveling across the grass from an area of brush. He's moving very quickly and smoothly, as if hauling on a bicycle. No up and down motion like running. Obviously, I'm pretty confused about a hillbilly on a bike in the middle of the night, but not surprised. He comes to a tree and stops. It's about this time we're driving by him. Look out window and see a man standing next to this tree with no bike or anything in sight. Just standing there staring at the truck passing by. My hair is standing up. We continued towards the call, and I asked my partner if he had seen that guy. His response is, "Man, I thought I was crazy." Edit for clarity, am I doing this right? He could have been freakishly fast running, old school ghost road/hid the bike, or I could be a plain dumb man, perhaps sleep deprived is a better description. What made it so freaky was the speed he floated across grass/gravel, the abrupt stop, and then the stare. Been doing this for years and it's the only thing that could come close to paranormal. Adding to the creepy factor was that we were miles from any house, store, or bar. Not a police officer, but I used to work in private security. For a bit I worked at a shopping mall. My partner and I already had a feeling this place was haunted, one reason being the homicide that happened right before I was hired. The very west of the mall made the hair on my neck stand up the most, and I don't know why. It's also good to note that there is an animal shelter at this end of the mall. You can see the cats and dogs through the windows at night. They would bark and whine a lot. One night I was walking to that end of the mall, and I started feeling like someone was following me or walking behind me. When I got to the shelter, none of the animals were making noise, but I swear to God all of the ones that were awake were staring at or behind me. I got really bad goosebumps and a horrible feeling in my gut. I put my head down and walked as fast as possible out of the closest door. Once I was outside, all of the negative feelings went away. Leo here. Okay, so I was supervising on evening shift in a small town in rural Australia. We have a large river that snakes its way past the town and runs close to some of the residential areas. It's a kilometer wide in some parts, has steep banks and thick bushes in the bed when it's dry. One of my crew was tied up with something and the other was attending two brothers threatening suicide after having a fight at a residence near the bank of the river. I heard the job and attended to give my crew a hand. Upon arrival, we found one brother who was self-harming and on drugs. We restrained him to prevent him from harming himself. He was telling us he wanted to kill himself and was taken to hospital via ambulance for mental health. As we had made the apprehension, my crew had to accompany the ambulance for everyone's safety. My crew leaves and then I'm told by the family that the other brother had run off down the river dry bank threatening to hang himself. The family said he was drunk but didn't have anything to actually hang himself with. I was concerned and attended the riverbank near where they thought he went down the river's steep bank. Both crews were busy, and I was by myself, at night, and it started raining lightly. I parked my unit at the top of the bank with the lights pointed onto the bush, hoping that if he saw my lights he'd come towards me. I got out my torch and made my way down the bank. I found a small clearing, and a small distance away was thick bush. I heard something moving in the bush. It sounded like something taking deliberate steps in the bush. I yelled out, thinking it was the guy I was after. I told him I was here to help and pleaded with him to come out. No response, and when I was talking, whatever it was stopped moving. I kept talking, attempting to make contact, as my instincts told me someone was in the thick bush in front of me. No response. My torch couldn't penetrate the bush, but I could hear distinct footfalls. I stopped making any noise, turned off my light and stood still listening. I hear movement coming towards me in the bush. I remained still and listened. It came closer. Without thinking, my hand went down to my gun, and I was ready to draw. I turned on my light and walked forward and heard whatever was moving away from me. I backed off, turned off my light and remained silent. It started coming closer to me, probing my position. I repeated the exercise once more, and once more it backed off and came back at a different angle. By this stage I was on high alert. Something told me to get out. I got this heavy, eerie feeling. Any animal that was down there would have run off upon my approach. No animal I know approaches/probes a human's position at night like that. Once I got the overwhelming feeling to leave, I backed off, with my hand in my gun, and I didn't turn my back until I had to climb up the bank. Once at the top and back with my car, I felt a lot better, but I could still hear something moving in the bush. I stayed there for a while as I was curious. I left and conducted inquiries about finding the missing brother on the other side of town, fast asleep and fine. To this day I don't know what I ran into down in the riverbed that night. My dad used to work as a correctional officer at Goulburn Jail in Australia, which is probably one of the oldest and hardest prisons there. A story he tells of his time is one I always remember. He said that the whole place was creepy anyway, not helped by some of the inmates at the time, including the notorious Ivan Milat, on which Wolf Creek is based. Anyway, the first thing he noticed was that dogs would outright refuse to enter the prison. He said they couldn't get them past the gate no matter how hard they tried. But the creepiest occurrence was one night when they heard the sound of running booted footsteps. Everyone was in their cell, so they couldn't figure out what was causing it. Next thing, all the doors of the open and unoccupied cells on the top floor were banged shut, one after the other with loud clangs. Then they see the source of the running noise. Now Dad swears this is what he and his colleague, so he has another witness, saw. Apparently they looked up and saw what looked like disembodied hobnail boots run down the aisle right over their heads, banging as they went. Dad decided to stop working in the prison not long after this. Super creepy. EMT here once had a call at our local mall. Show up and an 8-year-old was having breathing problems. Her mother, aunt and cousin had just been caught stealing, and it was late at night. We assumed the breathing problem was stress-induced. Once we got into the back of our unit, she looked my partner and myself in the eyes and said that she lived in a bad place. She said she lived with demons, and I tell you, not as she described the demons, her heart rate plummeted to 90 BPM to 45 BPM in a matter of seconds. My partner and I looked at each other and immediately started trying to lighten the mood and preparing for a code. She ended up being okay. I will never forget that experience. EMS here. Went on a difficulty breathing call. We showed up and the poor patient had been a cancer patient, and she had literally coughed up chunks of her lungs all over the bathroom. She was obviously dead, lying there against her toilet. My partner straightened up all of a sudden and said, "Can you feel that? She's still here." I was like, "Well, of course she is, moron. She's right there." And he turns and looks at the doorframe and says, "No, she's not left yet. She's right there watching us." I could feel the hair raised on the back of my neck, but I couldn't see anything. But of course, after someone said that it was impossible for me not to dismiss feeling like someone else was watching. EMS. Called to a house with the police at around 3 a.m. Relatively small, shared house with a lot of rooms and people who don't know each other living there. The caller reports that there is blood everywhere, all on the walls, staircase, in the kitchen, on the doorstep. He thinks one of the upstairs residents is into dodgy stuff, which I assume was meant to be drugs or crime of some kind or whatever. Well, we opened the door and sure enough there is blood everywhere. It's all on the floor and all the way up the stairs. It goes into the kitchen too but stops at the back door. There's a pool on the front doorstep but not a big one. A couple of police officers go upstairs ahead of me. I'm there thinking, well, if someone's lost this much blood there isn't a great deal we can do for them anyway, and if whoever did it is still in the house we're about to have a major scrap on our hands. In the UK, police are unarmed. We go to the door the dodgy guy is in, and knock. He kinda answers like yeah? The police officers say they're police and they need to have a word with him. He comes to the door in pajama trousers and says he was asleep. He's not injured and has no blood on him. There's none in his room. He lets the police officers have a search and his room is all fine. Seemed like a regular guy to me. We speak to all of the other neighbors in the house and the police officers search their rooms and nothing. No one heard anything, that they told us anyway, and no one had anything suspicious in their room. There was no blood in anyone's bedrooms, it was only on the stairs, hallways, kitchen, and front doorstep. The two police officers call for a dog unit to attend and search the area. The dog arrives but tracks the blood no further than the front doorstep. Whatever had caused that blood to be there seemed to still be in the house, and we had no idea whose blood it was. Though it could potentially have been an animal's blood somehow, unless it was a large animal, there was too much for that, and I hope we'd have found a bleeding large animal in our search. I had control pestering me to redeploy to another job, so I thanked the police officers for helping me clear the house and said I had to go. They said they were gonna go do a wider search and then resume, as well as there was nothing they could find. I never heard any more about it, and as far as I know there were no murders or anything like that reported after that incident, so it's still an absolute mystery. I'm not sure if I'd describe it as paranormal, but it was certainly strange and spooky. I didn't feel creeped out at the time, but had I been one of the people living in that house I definitely would have done. Other incidents I've been to that I guess can be paranormal are usually just sad mental health incidents. Occasionally we end up at addresses with very elderly people who see their dead wives in their house and talk to them. I once went to a job where an old guy was there with his son. While I was doing some tests on the old guy, he was talking to an empty chair next to him, saying stuff like, "Oh, it's okay, he's just checking my blood pressure, then they'll be out of here and we can go back to sleep." I didn't question it and got on with my work. When I spoke to the son afterwards, he said his mom died a few years before and his dad has never really come to terms with it. The dad always claims he can see his wife there with him when she isn't and talks to her like she is. Apparently he even sometimes makes her breakfast and tea still because he thinks she's actually there. Stuff like that is just sad rather than creepy though. Edit, because I've got a lot of comments about the investigation in the first story. I have no idea what investigation the police officers did. I know they thoroughly searched the house, got a dog to search the house and surrounding area, carried out a search of the neighborhood nearby, and called a supervisor down to investigate. After that I had literally no idea, as I was redeployed and had to go. There were still cops there when I left. I don't know the outcome as it's nothing to do with me, and we don't often speak to the police officers about stuff like that. I don't imagine they just looked at the scene, thought, weird. Anyway, let's go. I imagine there was some investigation done, but I really don't know what. Patrol officer here. This is not my story but my partner's, and all three officers on scene verified this story too. So, my partner responds to a priority breaking and entering call. A house sitter / dog sitter calls and says that he can hear loud banging and footsteps coming from downstairs, the ground floor, and he should be the only one at home. The house sitter and the dog are both upstairs, dog is in a cage. So, officers respond priority, including a K9 officer. Police released K9 into the house first to clear the house. K9 comes out empty-handed. 3 officers then go inside the house and clear it themselves. Again, nothing and nobody inside. Officers then stepped out front with the house sitter that called 911. As they're telling him the house is empty, they see the curtains of the bedroom window on the second floor open. They're heavy curtains and they parted from the center, so they claim it couldn't really be possible from air vents kicking on or anything like that. And all 3 officers and the house sitter all see it. Then the guy asks the police to come back inside with him because he's going to take the dog to a different home for the night and he needs to get the dog out of the cage. The police refuse to go back inside with him, not the best example of public service. Not a police officer, but had one tell us a story. When I was in like GR6 I lived in PEI, Prince Edward Island. We had the opportunity to talk to an officer. It was supposed to be like a DARE program thing. At the end we got to ask questions, and of course there'd be the typical questions that kids would ask like, did you ever shoot anyone? He shot it, but didn't actually shoot anyone, or so he told us. Then someone asks, what's the creepiest thing you've seen? I probably don't remember all the details because it was years ago, but it went kind of like this. There was a small island just off the coast of PI, and one night people had called the police to report a baby crying from the island. The police show up, and sure enough, they hear a baby crying. They make their way over to the cries, but when they get to the island the crying stopped. They searched everywhere and guessed what they found. Nothing. No baby or any sign that someone might be there. They started to leave the island, and immediately the baby crying starts up. Of course, they go back, and it stops. I can't remember how long they were looking, but they haven't found anything, and you could tell it has been bothering him for a long time from the way he talked about it. It always creeped me out, and I doubt I'll ever forget about it. Weird things happen on PEI. Edit, added clarification about what PEI is. This is unexplained, and probably just coincidence, but I still never mention it to my coworkers. I spent some time as a homicide investigator. We would respond to all apparent suicides and investigate them just to make sure it wasn't a homicide. Usually, we determined a motive for suicide and found a note or other indicator that the person killed themselves. One guy just taped a note to his chest that said, "Happy now bitch," and made sure his wife found him after he hanged himself. But occasionally you get a case where all forensic evidence indicates that the person killed themselves, but there's no note and no discernible reason this person would be suicidal. These are people in good health with decent careers and a seemingly happy family life. But who knows what's really going on with someone? Here's the part that freaks me out. I've worked on maybe 10 suicides like this. The last 3 before I left homicide all had the same thing at the scene. There was a little decorative wicker lighthouse at each location. It was the same lighthouse, same design, and painted white and blue. It stuck to me the first time because it was by the bed where the body was, but 2 weeks later I saw the same lighthouse on another suicide and even pointed out the coincidence to a patrol officer. A few months later I go on another suicide, and I see that same wicker lighthouse. That's when it clicks that it's always been unexplained suicides. I go back and look at crime scene photos from every suicide I've worked on. In 2 of them I see what the wicker lighthouse could be, but the angle is off and there's too much junk around to say for sure. I don't know. I thought it was creepy as hell, but I transferred a couple of months later and I let it go. Edit, well, that got more of a response than I was anticipating. To answer the question of, was it a serial killer, I very much doubt it. These were clearly suicides, most of which had no feasible alternative explanation. We work every suicide as if it were a homicide. Apparent suicide is almost always suicide, but we err on the side of caution. Also, while serial killers are actually more common than most people think, they rarely leave calling cards or anything like you see in movies. It's usually some man that has a particular taste. I really do think it was an odd coincidence, but it was still pretty creepy. I know an old detective who has lots of stories, one of which he loves to tell as a paranormal one. In his younger days 2 patrol officers found a woman in white wandering around a graveyard barefoot past midnight. They asked her what she was doing, and she said she was lost, so they took her back to the station. At the station, this detective was on duty with his partner, who handled the woman's case. His partner took down her details and let her go. The detective I know never saw her face, only his partner did, but he remembers seeing her back as she walked out of the station, and for some reason she was tiptoeing as she left. His partner ran her ID or name through the system after she left, and apparently she was supposed to be dead. At the time I was a 3rd shift caregiver in assisted living. We have pagers that go off if a resident pushes their call button asking us to help go to the bathroom, or if they fall, etc. We get a page about 12 a.m. to a resident's room, a woman who was one of my favorite people in the building at the time, who is wheelchair bound and she needs to use the restroom. Now she must have had pneumonia or something respiratory going on that wasn't diagnosed because the daughter never took her to get checked out and the resident refused to go to a doctor, but you could hear her troubled breathing from down the hall. When we got to the room, besides the fact that she had loud raspy breathing, she acted as if nothing was wrong. She was joking around and teasing my coworker and I as usual, but we could tell something was a little off by the way she was acting. We do 2-hour checks on the residents, so by this time it was about 2 a.m. We check one side of the building and make our way to the hallway with the woman, but as we turn the corner I stop. My coworker asks what's wrong, I tell her it's quiet and she realizes what I mean. The woman had passed. We made all the calls that we were to make per protocol, and they have her body moved out of the room by about 5-ish, and the last thing we have to do before shift change is unlock the front doors at about 5:45 a.m. I make my way to the double glass push doors to unlock them and open and close the door to make sure they were really unlocked. As the glass doors are closing, I see in the reflection of the glass is the woman who had just passed away sitting in the chair behind me. I spun around to find an empty chair. I've been in law enforcement for nearly 6 years, and I have had a few supernatural things occur during my shifts. The most recent one came from a 911 hang-up call. I was riding 2 men on a summer night, and it was probably around 2 or 3 a.m. when we get a call for a 911 hang-up. The only call comments where a call was placed to 911 and upon answering it the person hung up. When dispatch attempted to call the number back, no one answered. The area in which I was working that night I have basically spent my whole career in. There aren't a whole lot of streets I had yet to respond to. However, the address this call came to, they used GPS coordinates to find the closest location since the caller hung up, I had never been to. I had driven past this road many times but never actually recovered a call from it. We pull up to this old dirt road and it has a metal chain going across the entrance with a sign that says no trespassing. Because we have to figure out what is going on, me and my partner continue on foot up this long dirt/gravel road. The road was maybe about 100 yards long. The party was that on each side of the road was a tall chain link fence. Why this was crappy was because now me and my partner were now walking down a fatal funnel. If there happened to be a guy waiting for us at the end of this road with, let's just say, an assault rifle, we would have no place to take cover. Thankfully, this did not happen. We eventually reached the end of the road and there are 2 houses on each side. At first we believed one of these houses was where the 911 call had come from. As I am shining my flashlight at one of the houses, I see a figure move from inside. Instantly I'm like, oh, these people actually live back here, as I thought for sure the houses were going to be vacant. Shortly after, a man and a woman walk outside and ask what is going on. We told them we received a 911 hang-up call from address 123 Main, made up, and asked if they had called. The man tells us his address is 124 Main and the one across the street is 125 Main, which he says is vacant. He proceeds to tell us there is 123 Main, which is basically in the middle of these tall weeds/forest looking area just to the north of his house. He says the house is vacant and run down and can only be reached on foot. I asked him how far away it is from his house, and he says probably a couple of football fields away. Now while all this walking/investigating was going on, we had received 2 more 911 hang-up calls. Same address. Same result. Before we made this trek out into the middle of the woods, we called for another car and eventually another 2-man unit responded. The 4 of us now wandered out into the woods, 2 of us with our assault rifles out, and followed a barely beaten path to where we assumed we would find a house. Fighting spider webs and low-hanging tree branches, we eventually reached our destination. I am terrible at describing things, but this house was straight out of any horror movie you wanna imagine. It was run down. Had a tree that had fallen through the middle and had now become incorporated with the house throughout the years. The house was nearly falling apart and was completely overgrown by greenery. Having come this far, we decided to continue on, even though we were quite sure the house would be vacant. After fighting through some thick brush, we found our entrance. We each have to climb over some fallen brick walls and other wooden things before we actually make entry. My biggest fear at this point is this stupid rotten house collapsing on itself and being trapped inside with no one being able to find us. We searched the entire house and we thought no one was inside. And when I say we searched the entire house, I mean the entire house. Nothing was left unchecked. Feeling satisfied, we all climb our way back out and start heading back towards where the two original houses were. As we walk back, dispatch radios us and tells us they received another 911 hang-up call coming from the same address. This time dispatch tells us they were able to make a call back, and when the person answered, they could hear what sounded like a child playing on the phone. The four of us looked at each other and decided we were done with this call. We had done everything we could up to that point and were not about to get called back into possibly a demon's house because a child was on the phone. We cleared the call and don't receive any more 911 hang-up calls for the rest of the night. Fast forward maybe 6 months, and it's dead chilly winter. 911 hung up from the same address. This time it's me and 3 guys who weren't there previously. I tell them the story of what happened and all 3 are super psyched and want to check it out. The 4 of us walk back out to this house, now much easier to get to since the cold had killed off a lot of the greens. The 3 of them decide to go into the house. I wait outside as I already had my fun. They don't make it too far once they realize this house is about to collapse on itself. We all leave again. No call back from a child this time. If I ever go out there again, I'll try and get a picture of the house just so when I tell other people this story they can have a better understanding of this house and actually what it is. I was an electrician in the Navy serving on the Iwo Jima LHD-7. LHDs are roughly half the size of an aircraft carrier, so as you can imagine, they are quite large. Several friends supposedly had heard voices in out-of-the-way engineering spaces. The previous Iwo Jima had a steam leak that killed 10 engineers, and I had been in several creepy spaces on the ship, but other than a general feeling of unease, nothing weird happened to me. That is until one night, a couple of months, before I got out of the Navy. We were doing cleaning on the electrical switchboards. This required killing power to the majority of the ship. We did this in the middle of the night after working hours, and the only people on board were a handful of duty section personnel and about 30 of us electricians. In the Navy, when securing power to equipment, you hang red danger tags on breakers and fuses so that way people know not to turn on said power source because they may cause injury or death to someone. A friend and I went to hang several danger tags in a pump room. The main power had already been shut off, so the area of the ship we were in was pitch black except for our flashlights. To enter this pump room, we had to open a hatch in the hangar bay, climb down a steep vertical ladder, and go down another short vertical ladder. At this point, we are below the waterline. We hung the danger tags in the upper part of the pump room, then headed down the stairs to the lower section with my friend in the lead. Halfway way down the stairs, I hear what sounds like a woman scream. I stop. My friend stops. Keep in mind there are very few people on board the ship at this time, and we were the only ones in this part of the ship. He turns to me and asks if I just heard a woman scream. I say, I didn't, and neither did you. We hang the last tags as quickly as possible and exit the pump room. We were greeted by our chief in the hangar bay and asked her if she had heard a scream. She hadn't, and she told us she had been standing outside the hatch since shortly after we had entered. Asked the women in our division if any of them had screamed that night. No one had. And I never went into that pump room again. I was working as a paramedic and my station had a mental hospital in our area. They knew they weren't allowed to call us for basic transport, that it had to be an emergency. We get a call there one night for a possible stroke on the 4th floor. We knew that the 4th floor is where they kept people who were guilty of murder, tape, etc., and that a police officer would be with us. When we get there, the nurse has this look on her face that we are really about to walk into something unsure. She tells us that the lady won't stop looking to the left, her excuse for calling us and saying it was a stroke, and talking to something. When we walk into the room, she's in full conversation with something outside the window. We asked her to talk to us and she got quiet. We load her up and Leo cuffs her to the gurney. When we got outside, she looked back towards the window, then quickly shot her head to the other side and said it's so cool how fast they fly. About 5 minutes from the hospital, she asks me if I'm worried that the ambulance is about to break down so that her and her flying yellow friends could tape and kill us. I said no, and she started this screeching laugh that I'll never forget. Leo was as white as snow and said nothing to her. We dropped her off in the came back outside, and the ambulance had been cut off and wouldn't start. I went back inside to ask Leo if he had turned it off, and they said no. Leo walked inside with us. We couldn't find him, and dispatch sent a bunch of cars to look, but he wasn't at the hospital. They found him sitting in his cruiser back at mental hospital, and he couldn't remember how he got there. To this day, I really think of her, and the officer saw something.